Hello PA Cyber, this is Mrs. Martin from the Harrisburg Support Center coming to you from my home, actually the kitchen, in Middletown, PA. Today is May 11th, 2011. The weather today is beautiful and sunny, about 75 degrees, perfect spring day. In my previous podcast, I discussed the Woodstock 1969 Music Festival, which was a huge-scale protest to the Vietnam War in the form of music. For one weekend, in August 1969, 500,000 concertgoers peacefully coexisted to demonstrate against the politics and the violence of the Vietnam War. Great musicians such as Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and the Grateful Dead played at this infamous event, and we have seen nothing like it ever since. At the exact opposite end of the spectrum, on May 4th, 1970, Kent State saw a Vietnam protest become extremely violent, which concluded with the death of 4 students. Let me begin with a brief timeline of how the Kent State shootings came about. On April 30th, 1970, President Richard Nixon announced the American invasion of Cambodia. At Kent State University, a demonstration with about 500 students was held on May 1st on the Commons. Around 1 p.m., another rally was planned for May 4th to continue the protest of Nixon's expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia. There was widespread anger, and many protesters issued a call to bring the war home. As a symbolic protest to Nixon's decision to send troops, a group of students watched a graduate student burning a copy of the U.S. Constitution while another student burned his draft card. Trouble and vandalism spread through the neighboring town, and police arrived to calm everybody down. City officials and downtown businesses began to receive threats that revolutionaries were going to destroy the city and university. The National Guard was called on Saturday, May 2nd, and the campus ROTC building was set on fire. Several students surrounded the buildings and cheered, which further fueled the tension among ROTC candidates, administrators, and students. On May 3rd, Governor Rhodes made an emotional speech citing the students were un-American. That evening, a rally was held on the Commons, and the American Guard used tear gas to disperse the crowd. By that evening, tensions were high and violence was inevitable. On Monday, May 4th, a protest was scheduled to be held at noon. University officials attempted to ban the gathering, handing out 12,000 leaflets stating the event was canceled. Despite this, an estimated 200,000 students gathered on the university's commons. Protesters began throwing rocks at the guardsmen, striking one campus patrolman. Just before noon, the guard returned and again ordered the crowd to disperse. When most of the crowd refused, the guard used tear gas again. Because of wind, the tear gas had little effect in dispersing the crowd, and some launched a second volley of rocks toward the guards' lines to chants of "Pigs off campus." The students threw the tear gas canisters back at the National Guardsmen, who wore protective gas masks. When it was determined the crowd was not going to disperse, a group of 77 National Guard troops from A Company and Troop G, with bayonets fixed on their rifles, began to advance on the crowd. As the guardsmen advanced, the protesters retreated over a hill near the Commons. Once over the hill, the students continued moving towards a nearby parking lot. The guardsmen pursued the protesters over the hill, but rather than veering left as the protesters had, they continued straight, heading down toward an athletic practice field enclosed by a chain-linked fence. Here they remained for about 10 minutes, unsure of how to get out of the area that they were in. During this time, the bulk of the students congregated off to the left in front of the guardsmen, approximately 150 to 250 feet away. At one point, some of the guardsmen knelt and aimed their weapons towards the parking lot, then stood up again. For a few moments, several guardsmen formed a loose huddle and appeared to be talking to one another. The guardsmen appeared to be unsure as to what to do next. They cleared the protesters from the Commons area, and many students had left, but some stayed and were still angrily confronting the soldiers. Some began throwing more rocks and tear gas canisters. About 10 minutes later, the guardsmen began to retrace their steps back up the hill toward the Commons area. Some of the students on the Taylor Hall veranda began to move slowly toward the soldiers. At this point, approximately at 12:20 p.m., Sergeant Taylor turned and began firing at the students with his .45 pistol. A number of guardsmen nearest the students also turned and fired their rifles at the students. In all, 29 of the 77 guardsmen claimed to have fired their weapons, using a final total of 67 rounds of ammunition. The shooting was determined to have lasted only 13 seconds. The shootings killed 4 students and wounded 9. 2 of the 4 students killed, Allison Krause and Jeffrey Miller, had participated in the protest, and the other 2, Sandra Schuer and William Knox Schroeder, had been walking from one class to the next at the time of their deaths. Schroeder was also a member of the campus ROTC chapter. Of those wounded, none was closer than 71 feet away from the soldiers. Of those killed, the nearest was 265 feet away, and their average distance from the guardsmen was 345 feet. Photographs of the dead and wounded at Kent State that were distributed in newspapers and periodicals worldwide amplified sentiment against the United States invasion of Cambodia and the Vietnam War in general. In particular, the camera of Kent State photojournalism student John Philo captured a 14-year-old runaway, Marianne Vecchio, screaming over the body of the dead student Jeffrey Miller, who had been shot in the mouth. The photograph, which won a Pulitzer Prize, became the most enduring image of the events and one of the most enduring images of the anti-Vietnam War movement. The shootings led to protests on college campuses throughout the United States and a student strike, causing more than 450 campuses across the country to close with both violent and nonviolent demonstrations. A common sentiment was expressed by students at New York University with a banner hung out of a window which read, "They can't kill us all." Just 5 days after the shootings, 100,000 people demonstrated in Washington, D.C. against the war and the killing of unarmed student protesters. People became increasingly violent in the streets. Not only was President Nixon taken to Camp David for 2 days for his own protection, but Charles Colson stated that the military was called up to protect the administration from the angry students. The Kent State campus remained closed for 6 weeks. Clearly, the Kent State shootings are a travesty in American history and proves to us that violence is never a means to an end. As you can see, the Kent State occurrence is the antithesis of the peaceful coexistence of the Woodstock Festival. One has to ask how this Vietnam protest got to such a violent place when the reasons for protesting in the first place was because of an aggressive invasion of another country. Thank you for listening, and I hope you got something out of this brief history lesson. The information in this podcast has been borrowed from Wikipedia. Music is courtesy of Neil Young. Thank you very much.